They were told the Americans would take everything. So why did the first guard step back like he was protecting something? The transport truck rolled to a stop and the engine ticked itself quiet, the kind of small metallic sound that seems louder when everyone is holding their breath. The air was heavy with salt and damp canvas, and the night carried a soft, steady chorus of insects from somewhere beyond the fence line. A single floodlight washed the receiving area in a pale, hard glow, turning faces into sharp planes and shadows into long, nervous shapes. The women came down one at a time, not rushing, not resisting, simply moving the way people move when they've learned that suddenness invites attention. Some were young, some older, all thin from weeks measured in ration lines and waiting. They kept their eyes low, because looking up had been punished in other places, and because rumors traveled faster than any truck. That victory meant humiliation. That paperwork was only the polite name for cruelty, that the first hands to meet them would not be careful. Their shoulders were squared anyway. It wasn't bravery that made their backs straight. It was the last thing they still controlled. Across the gravel stood a line of American uniforms, silhouettes cut clean against the light, boots planted shoulder-width apart, rifles slung but not raised, faces set in that neutral expression soldiers learn when they don't want to show anything at all. Captain Robert Hayes held a clipboard at his chest, as if it were a shield made of paper. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He simply watched the spacing between bodies the way an engineer watches a bridge. Sergeant Ethan Cole stood half a step behind him, the kind of man who looked as if he had been built out of rules and the habit of following them. Off to the side, a young MP, Corporal Daniel Brooks, kept his hands open, fingers relaxed, not because he was gentle by nature, but because open hands made a promise without saying a word. The women expected shouting. They expected someone to point too close, to shove them into place, to grab an elbow and squeeze hard enough to remind them who owned the moment. Instead, the first order came calmly, in plain English, then again in slower words, the tone steady, almost bored. Line up. 2 rows. A gesture. Followed. An arm raised, a palm turned, the direction indicated like a teacher guiding a class to seats. No one reached out. No one took hold. The women hesitated, not because they didn't understand, but because the absence of roughness felt like a trap. One of them, small, hair pinned back with a strip of cloth, took a cautious step forward. Another followed. Gravel crunched under soft shoes. The floodlight hummed. Captain Hayes scanned faces, then checked a list, then looked up again, as if matching names to breathing. Sergeant Cole set a canvas bag on the ground rather than handing it directly to anyone, then stepped back a full pace, leaving space like a boundary drawn in air. The women noticed that. They noticed everything. The distance was not indifference. It was deliberate. It was discipline. It was a strange kind of respect, the kind that doesn't ask permission but still refuses to steal it. A gust pushed at the corner of a tent, and for an instant the fabric snapped like a flag. One woman flinched. Corporal Brooks saw it and didn't move closer, didn't lean in to inspect her fear. He simply adjusted his stance so his shadow didn't fall over her. Captain Hayes finally spoke, not to the prisoners, but to his own men, voice low, clipped, carrying just far enough to be heard. Professional. No exceptions. It was not a speech. It was not comfort. It was a standard. And in that first minute, under the glare of a single light, in a place built for holding, something shifted so quietly it could have been mistaken for the wind. The women realized the worst thing they'd been warned about was not happening, and that the silence between them and the Americans was not empty at all. It was a line. Morning did not arrive with any softness. It arrived like a rule, a thin gray light sliding under canvas, the smell of wet earth, the clink of a canteen against a belt buckle somewhere outside. The women woke before anyone called them because sleep had become a shallow habit, the kind that breaks at the smallest sound. In the receiving tent, the air was cooler than the night before, and the floodlight had been replaced by daylight that showed everything more honestly. The gravel was still there. The fence was still there. The men in uniform were still there. But the space between them felt different now that it could be measured. Captain Robert Hayes moved down a folding table where forms were stacked in neat piles, each sheet aligned like it had been squared by a ruler. Lieutenant James Carter sat with a pen that scratched steadily, writing full names when he could find them, writing numbers when he could not. He had the careful face of a man who understood that the way you record a person can either shrink them or keep them intact. Sergeant Ethan Cole stood by a crate of supplies with his hands behind his back, watching the line not as a threat, but as a flow that could become disorder if it was treated casually. Corporal Daniel Brooks checked the perimeter, eyes scanning, posture quiet, the kind of guard who did not look for power in staring someone down. One by one, the women stepped forward for intake. No one was rushed. No one was pulled into place. Instructions came plain and slow, repeated without frustration, with the same tone a clerk might use in a small-town office. Stand here. Step forward when called. Place your belongings on the ground. Keep your hands visible. The words were firm, but they did not carry insult. That difference was so unfamiliar it took effort to believe. A young woman with tired eyes reached the table and froze when Lieutenant Carter held up a tag for her to read. Her fingers hovered, not touching it, as if paper could burn. Carter lowered the tag to the tabletop instead, sliding it toward her, giving her time to decide. Across the line, Sergeant Cole opened a field kit and began distributing small essentials: soap, a towel, a canteen, a comb. Each item was set down with a measured motion, then his hand withdrew. It was not tenderness. It was restraint practiced until it became instinct. The women watched the hands more than the faces. Hands were where harm began. Here, hands stayed honest. A medic passed behind the table, not hurried, carrying a clipboard and a stethoscope. Captain Hayes spoke to him in low tones, pointing to a shaded section near a tent flap, a place arranged for basic checkups with privacy screens and a chair. Even the way the chair was angled mattered. It did not face the open camp. It faced the canvas wall. Line of sight controlled on purpose. One of the older women noticed that and swallowed hard, as if her throat had been holding a stone for months. She was not grateful. She was cautious, but her shoulders lowered a fraction. A small thing. A real thing. As intake continued, the camp made its usual sounds: a generator humming, a distant radio playing a faint tune that none of the women recognized, metal cups tapping as someone set up for breakfast. The smell of coffee drifted briefly, bitter and warm, then disappeared. Captain Hayes walked the line once more, eyes on details that did not look heroic: the distance between guards and prisoners, the placement of screens, the way a man shifted when a woman stepped forward, making sure his body did not block her path. He did not correct loudly. He did not make a show. When he saw Corporal Brooks adjust, so his shadow moved off a woman's face. Hayes only nodded, a motion so small it could have been a twitch. Lieutenant Carter wrote, Sergeant Cole distributed, and the women began to understand the day would be governed by rules that did not require humiliation to function. They had arrived expecting to be reduced to something less than human. Instead, they were being processed like people whose dignity was inconvenient but still mandatory. In that quiet, the women learned a new kind of fear, not fear of what would be done to them, but fear of what it meant to meet an enemy who refused to become a monster. By late afternoon, the camp had settled into a routine that looked ordinary from a distance. A line for water, a line for food, a line for names. Ordinary was the most unsettling thing about it. The women moved through the day as if walking on thin ice, testing each step for hidden cracks. They did not speak much, not because they had nothing to say, but because every place they had been taught them that words could be used against you. Even their silence felt like an object they carried carefully. Captain Robert Hayes watched that silence the way he watched the perimeter fence, not with suspicion, but with attention. He knew fear had its own schedule. It did not vanish because rules were posted. It waited for a moment when a guard looked away, when a man got tired, when the day grew long. Sergeant Ethan Cole understood it too, though he did not name it. He simply tightened procedures the way you tighten straps on a load before a rough road. No wandering inside the barracks area. No loitering near supply crates. No unnecessary contact. Lieutenant James Carter kept his pen moving, because paper had a calming effect on chaos. Corporal Daniel Brooks remained where shadows fell, because he was learning that sometimes the most important thing a guard could do was become predictable. The women had been fed stories for years, stories that made the enemy into a single shape. Those stories were convenient. They explained everything. They made suffering feel inevitable. Now the enemy had faces, and those faces did not match the stories, which made the women uneasy in a new way. If the Americans were not monsters, then the world was more complicated than they had been allowed to believe. Complication was dangerous. It required choices. It required thinking. In the barracks tent, under a canvas roof that smelled of sun and mildew, a younger woman sat on her cot and stared at the soap she had been given. It was a plain bar, wrapped in simple paper, nothing special. And yet it felt like a question placed in her hands. Soap was for a person who expected to be alive tomorrow. Soap implied time. She set it down as if it might accuse her of hoping. Across from her, an older woman folded her towel into a neat rectangle, then unfolded it, then folded it again, not because she cared about neatness, but because motion kept panic from rising. Outside, a bell sounded once to signal meal time. A single metal note that did not carry threat, only instruction. The women lined up, heads slightly lowered, but they noticed how the line was managed. Sergeant Cole stood at an angle that kept the food table within his sight, but he did not stand behind them. He did not crowd their backs. He did not press them forward. When a woman took an extra second to understand what she was being offered, he waited. Waiting was an invisible form of respect. It cost nothing and proved everything. Lieutenant Carter walked past with a stack of forms, then stopped when he saw one of the women holding her tag upside down. He did not laugh. He did not correct her sharply. He turned the tag on the table so the numbers faced her and tapped lightly beside it, giving her a way to save face. The woman nodded once, so small it could have been mistaken for a blink. Captain Hayes passed behind the food line and heard a guard mutter something under his breath, not a slur, not cruelty, just impatience. Hayes stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a show for anyone. He leaned close enough that the guard could hear him and said, "Do not let the uniform make you careless." Then he moved on. The correction was private, but the standard was public. The women saw that too. They saw that the rules applied to the men as much as to them. And still, their bodies did not trust it. One woman kept her hands clasped in front of her at all times, as if holding herself together. Another refused to turn her back on any doorway. A third flinched when a radio crackled, not because of the sound, but because it reminded her of commands. The Americans were not touching them. That fact should have been relief. Instead, it became a test the women could not stop taking. Every hour that passed without harm forced them to confront a deeper fear, that the enemy's restraint might be real, and that real restraint demanded something in return, not surrender, but recognition. In the space between two lines of people, under a sky that was slowly clearing, the camp was doing something war rarely allowed. It was making both sides look at each other long enough to see what they had become. On the second night, the rain came without drama, a steady curtain that turned the dust to dark paste and softened the edges of the camp. Water drummed on canvas roofs and ran in thin streams along the shallow trenches that had been cut for drainage. Inside the women's barracks, the air smelled like damp cloth and soap that had finally been unwrapped. The lights were low, not because anyone wanted secrecy, but because the generator had its limits. That kind of ordinary limitation made the place feel less like a stage and more like a world. A few women sat on their cots with their hands folded, listening to the rain as if it were a language they almost remembered. Others lay still, eyes open, waiting for footsteps that did not come. Outside, Captain Robert Hayes walked the line with his collar turned up, clipboard tucked under his arm to keep it dry. He did not patrol like a man hunting trouble. He patrolled like a man refusing to allow it. Sergeant Ethan Cole followed at a respectful distance, boots steady, never splashing too loudly. Corporal Daniel Brooks stood under a small awning near the supply tent, rainwater tracing a line off the brim of his helmet, his face calm in the dim light. In war, nights were when rules got sloppy. Hayes had learned that. Night was where bad decisions hid behind fatigue. He stopped near the mess area where a young guard had left a crate too close to the walkway, forcing anyone passing to squeeze by. Hayes nudged the crate back with his boot, not kicking, just moving it as if correcting a chair in a hallway. The point was not the crate. The point was the space. Space kept people safe. Space kept people human. On the other side of the camp, a medic made a quiet round with a lantern, checking on coughs and fevers, speaking softly through the flap of each tent rather than stepping inside. The women noticed that too. They noticed the way questions were asked from the doorway, the way the lantern stayed low to avoid blinding tired eyes, the way the medic waited for an answer instead of pushing through silence. One of the women, The older one, who folded and unfolded her towel, had been watching everything since arrival. She had the kind of memory that stored details the way a pocket stores small stones. She stood and walked to the end of the barracks where a narrow gap in the canvas showed a slice of the outside. Through it, she saw Sergeant Cole speaking to a guard whose posture had gone casual, whose boots had wandered too close to the barracks line. Cole did not grab him. He did not shove him back. He pointed to the chalk mark on the ground, then to his own boot, then stepped behind the mark as if demonstrating a simple lesson. The guard nodded and adjusted. No humiliation. No laughter. Just correction. The older woman turned away slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too fast. In the corner, a younger woman was shivering, not from cold, but from the delayed tremor of adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Another woman offered her the towel she had been saving, holding it out at arm's length, not touching, mirroring the same careful distance the Americans used. The towel changed hands without fingers brushing. Even kindness had learned to respect boundaries here. Later, when the rain eased into a lighter patter, Lieutenant James Carter appeared near the barracks with a folder held over his head like a makeshift roof. He did not enter. He stood outside the flap and spoke to the interpreter in a low voice, explaining that the women would be moved the next day to a more permanent area with better drainage, that the cots would stay dry, that the food line would be under cover. He did not promise comfort. He promised order. The interpreter translated, and the words fell into the tent like dry matches that refused to spark into hope. Still, something shifted. The younger woman stopped shivering. The older woman sat down and, for the first time, let her shoulders rest against the canvas wall. Outside, Hayes watched the rainwater run and thought about the strange burden of winning. Victory did not only give power. It demanded restraint. Anyone could take. It took discipline to refuse. When he passed Corporal Brooks, he paused. Brooks met his eyes, then looked away, scanning the dark like a habit. Hayes said only, "Keep your distance." Brooks answered, "Yes, sir," as if it were the simplest order in the world. In the women's barracks, the sound of rain kept going, steady and plain, and the quiet between prisoners and guards grew heavier with meaning. The enemy was not reaching for them. The enemy was building a line and holding it. And the women began to understand that sometimes the most shocking power was the power to stop. The next morning the camp smelled cleaner, not because the place had changed, but because the rain had washed the air and forced everyone into a slower pace. The ground still held puddles, and the gravel clung to boots in little black beads. A thin ribbon of sunlight broke through the clouds and lit the intake area like a quiet inspection. Captain Robert Hayes stood near the supply tent with Lieutenant James Carter, reviewing the plan to move the women to the drier section before evening. Sergeant Ethan Cole had already marked a path with stakes and rope, keeping foot traffic away from soft spots where someone could slip. Corporal Daniel Brooks watched the route the way he watched the fence line, not looking for a fight, looking for a problem before it became one. The women were called out in small groups, not crowded, not rushed. They came with their issued kits tucked under their arms, towels folded, canteens sealed, faces still guarded. Some looked thinner in daylight. Some looked older. But the straightness in their posture was the same. Hayes noticed the small pattern that had formed over the last 2 days. When an American stepped forward, the women stepped back. When an American spoke, they listened without lifting their eyes. They were not disobedient. They were braced. He did not take it personally. Fear was older than language. Carter began reading names and numbers, careful with pronunciation, pausing when the interpreter offered guidance. He held each paper down on the table rather than offering it in midair, a simple choice that kept hands from meeting. Cole demonstrated where to place bags during the move, setting them on the ground along a chalk line, then stepping back as if the line were a boundary that mattered as much as a fence. One of the younger women, the one who had stared at the bar of soap like it was an accusation, shifted her bag and hesitated when the strap snagged. The bag tipped, and a few items slid out onto the wet gravel: a comb, a folded cloth, a small tin cup. It was nothing important, but in her body it landed like a disaster. She froze, shoulders tight, waiting for the sharp tone that usually followed mistakes. Corporal Brooks was closest. He saw the spill, and his first instinct was to help. Then he stopped himself, like a man catching his hand before it crossed a line. He did not step into her space. He crouched down at a distance of about 3 feet, on his side of the chalk mark, and with 2 fingers he nudged the tin cup gently across the gravel toward the line, stopping it where she could reach it without moving closer to him. He did the same with the comb, pushing it slowly, letting it slide, never lifting it, never making it feel like he was handling something that belonged to her. His eyes stayed on the ground, not on her face, as if he understood that being looked at too closely could feel like being grabbed. The woman stared, not at the cup, but at the space he was refusing to cross. Her hands trembled once. Then she reached down and collected her things. She did not thank him. Gratitude would have been too loud. Instead, she straightened and gave a small bow of her head, the smallest movement her pride would allow. Brooks rose and stepped back again, returning to his post as if nothing had happened. Hayes watched the exchange and felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not sentiment, just confirmation that discipline could be taught and held even in mud and fatigue. He turned to Cole and spoke in a voice meant for his men more than for the women. "This is how we do it. No shortcuts." Cole answered without looking away from the line. "Yes, sir." Carter kept writing, his pen steady, documenting the moment with numbers and time stamps that would never capture its weight. The women resumed moving along the marked path, their steps careful. They still expected the world to punish them for existing. But now they had seen something that did not fit their fear. An armed man choosing patience over power, choosing distance as a form of control. The shock was not that the Americans had rules. The shock was that the rules were for the Americans too, and that a simple act like sliding a tin cup across wet gravel could carry the message the women needed most to survive the day. You will be handled as little as possible, because you are still yours. By the 3rd day, the move to the drier section had turned the camp into something closer to a system than a holding pen. The new area sat on slightly higher ground, maybe 2 feet above the puddled lanes near intake, and that small difference changed everything. The walkways stayed firm. The tents did not sag at the edges. The women could step outside without sinking. It was still confinement, still rules, still fences, but the ground itself no longer felt like it was trying to pull them down. Captain Robert Hayes noticed how quickly people's bodies respond to stability. When the mud disappeared, the women stopped watching their feet every second. When they stopped watching their feet, they started noticing faces. That was dangerous in its own way. Seeing clearly meant remembering clearly. Lieutenant James Carter set up a small station under an awning, paper weighted down with smooth stones so the wind could not steal it. He organized the daily schedule into simple blocks: breakfast, medical checks, sanitation, rest. A list was posted in plain view, and the interpreter read it out loud twice. Sergeant Ethan Cole walked the perimeter of the new section and placed chalk marks where guards were to stand, like invisible rails that kept everyone from drifting into each other. Corporal Daniel Brooks stood his shift near the water point, a place where tension usually gathered, because thirst could turn even quiet people sharp. The first time the women lined up for water in the new area, they came with canteens held close to their ribs as if guarding them. The spigot was a simple metal fixture attached to a barrel, nothing special, but the line in front of it felt like a narrow bridge. Brooks watched the spacing. He watched shoulders. He watched hands. Then he did something so small, it almost vanished in the heat shimmer. He stepped back 1 pace farther than necessary, giving the first woman room to lean forward without passing within arm's reach of him. It was not a gesture of softness. It was a tactic that said, "You will not have to flinch today." The older woman, the one with stone pocket memory, noticed and adjusted her own stance, leaving a gap behind her so the woman in line did not feel trapped. The habit of distance began to spread among them like a quiet lesson. Later, a misunderstanding arrived the way misunderstandings always arrived, through language and speed. A young guard, new to the camp, pointed too sharply at the line when 2 women hesitated, and his finger cut the air like a warning. The women stiffened as one body. One took a half step backward, colliding lightly with the person behind her. The line wavered. The air changed. Sergeant Cole saw it immediately. He moved in, not fast, not aggressive, just decisive. He did not touch the guard. He did not touch the women. He placed himself between the pointed finger and the line and lowered his own hand to his side, palm open. Then he spoke in a voice that carried instruction without heat. "Slow down. Use your words." The new guard started to speak, breath quick, pride rising. But Captain Hayes was already there, appearing like a shadow that had chosen a shape. Hayes looked at the guard and said, "We do not signal at people like that." The guard blinked, confused, then embarrassed. Hayes did not scold him in front of everyone. He simply said, "Step back." The guard obeyed. Hayes turned to the interpreter and said, "Tell them the line is fine. Tell them they are not in trouble." The interpreter spoke, and the women listened, faces still tight. Then Brooks did what he had learned to do. He shifted his position so his body no longer blocked the spigot. He looked at the ground, not at them, and said, slowly, "Water, one at a time." The simplicity gave everyone something to hold. The first woman stepped forward. The metal spigot squeaked. Water splashed into a canteen with a sound that made the whole moment feel suddenly real and normal. The line steadied. The crisis dissolved without anyone raising a voice, without anyone being grabbed, without anyone paying for fear with humiliation. Afterward, Hayes walked the new guard toward the administrative tent and spoke quietly enough that only Cole could hear. "You can be tired. You can be new. You cannot be careless." The guard nodded, swallowing hard, learning that discipline was not only for prisoners. Across the yard, the women finished filling their canteens and returned to their tents. No one said thank you. No one smiled. But the older woman folded her towel once, neatly, and placed it at the edge of her cot like a marker of control. And the younger woman, the one who had once stared at soap like it was a trap, opened her canteen, took a careful sip, and did not look over her shoulder afterward. On the fourth day the camp learned a new rhythm, one that did not depend on surprise. The schedule stayed posted. The lines formed at the same times. The guards rotated in the same order. Predictability did not make the fences disappear, but it changed what the fences did inside a person's mind. Lieutenant James Carter noticed it first because he dealt in small changes. A woman who stepped forward when her number was called without waiting to be prompted. A woman who held her own tag the right way up. A woman who asked for soap with a gesture that was neither pleading nor defiant. Carter wrote those things down in the margins of his own mind, because the official forms had no box for dignity returning in inches. Captain Robert Hayes watched the women from the administrative tent doorway, coffee in a tin cup cooling in his hand, and he understood that the camp was becoming a mirror. A mirror for the prisoners, who were being forced to see the enemy as human, and a mirror for his men, who were being forced to see themselves as the kind of Americans they claimed to be. Sergeant Ethan Cole walked the sanitation detail with the same seriousness he gave perimeter checks, because in his world, order was not a convenience. It was protection. Corporal Daniel Brooks stayed near the water point again, where the air always felt 1 degree tighter than anywhere else. The women came in line with canteens and towels, eyes still cautious, but their shoulders did not rise as high as before. Then a small incident arrived, not as danger, but as temptation. A box of donated supplies had come in from a nearby unit. Extra blankets, a few books with worn covers, and a handful of small items that did not fit neatly into inventory. Lieutenant Carter opened the box under the awning and sorted it with careful hands. He held up a paperback, thumbed through pages, then set it aside. One of the women looked at the book and looked away quickly, as if reading were another kind of risk. Carter understood. In her old world, knowledge had been controlled and assigned. Here, knowledge was sitting in a box like an unclaimed object. Hayes stepped closer and said, "We will distribute what we can. No crowding." Cole echoed the instruction to the guards. Brooks took one step back from the table to widen the space. The women approached slowly in groups of 3, watching the hands, watching the distance, watching for the moment when generosity turned into a power game. Carter placed a blanket on the table and slid it forward. Then he placed a small bar of soap. Then a paperback with a plain cover. He did not hold anything out. He did not force choice. He made the table itself the neutral ground. The older woman, the one who folded her towel like a ritual, stepped forward and paused at the edge of the awning. Her eyes moved from the blanket to the book, then to Carter's face, then away. She reached for the blanket first, fingers careful, then stopped when her sleeve brushed the corner of the table. The brush was nothing. Still, she stiffened, the old reflex trying to reclaim her body. Carter saw it and shifted the items slightly closer, reducing the reach she had to make. The adjustment was small and silent. The woman took the blanket. Then, after a beat that felt like a decision made in private, she placed her fingertips on the paperback and slid it toward herself rather than lifting it, as if even a book could be handled with caution. She turned, holding it against her ribs the way she held the canteen, and walked back without looking at anyone. A younger guard nearby watched the exchange and smirked, not cruelly, just with the lazy amusement of someone who had not learned what mattered yet. Hayes saw the smirk and said nothing at first. He waited until the women were out of earshot. Then he looked at the guard and said, "That is not funny." The guard's smile fell. Hayes continued, voice low. "If you cannot treat a book like it matters, you will not treat a person like they matter." The guard swallowed and nodded once. Cole's eyes flicked toward Hayes, a brief acknowledgement. Brooks kept his gaze on the ground, because he understood the lesson was not for him alone. Later, inside the women's tent, the older woman sat on her cot and opened the paperback. The pages smelled like dust and someone else's hands. She traced the first line with her finger without reading it out loud. The younger woman who had stared at soap before sat beside her, close but not touching, and leaned in just enough to see the shapes of the letters. Outside, the rain clouds had finally broken into a clean blue sky, and sunlight hit the fence in a way that made it look almost delicate. Inside the tent, the older woman turned a page. It was the quietest sound in the camp, and it carried the loudest meaning, a prisoner taking back the right to look forward. On the 5th day the camp felt almost quiet, not because people were calm, but because they had learned where their voices did not help. The sun came up clean and bright, drying the last damp corners of canvas and leaving the air sharp with salt and kerosene. Captain Robert Hayes stood outside the administrative tent and listened to the morning sounds. Metal cups set down, boots on gravel, a distant gull. Routine had a way of hiding tension, but Hayes had learned that tension never truly left. It simply changed its shape. Lieutenant James Carter brought him a folder with the day's notes and a short list of questions from higher command, all phrased politely, all carrying weight. How many prisoners? How many medical issues? Any incidents? Hayes answered with the facts, then paused at the part no form could ask for. The way fear had begun to loosen its grip without anyone laying a hand on anyone. Sergeant Ethan Cole was already inspecting the chalk lines near the women's section, refreshing the marks where yesterday's boots had scuffed them. To Cole, those lines were not decoration. They were the difference between order and something he refused to name. Corporal Daniel Brooks took his post near the supply area where the donated box had been emptied. The women passed there on their way to sanitation detail, towels folded, canteens clipped, their steps more even than before. The older woman carried the paperback tucked under her arm like a private tool. The younger woman walked beside her, close enough to share shade, far enough to keep the new habit of distance. Then the moment came that tested the new trust without warning. A gust of wind cut through the camp and lifted a stack of loose papers off a table near Carter's station, sending them skittering across the gravel like pale birds. One sheet slid under the edge of the awning, another spun into a puddle, ink bleeding at the corners. Carter lunged for them on instinct and stopped short when he realized the papers had drifted toward the women's line. The women froze. Paper had always been dangerous to them. Orders, lists, accusations, documents that decided where you went and what you became. Now paper was loose and uncontrolled, and in that split second, everything old tried to return. One woman stepped back as if the paper itself could strike her. Another lifted her hands slightly, palms outward, a reflex of surrender. Sergeant Cole started to move, then checked himself, because moving fast toward the women could make the fear worse. Brooks watched the nearest sheet slide to a stop at the edge of a chalk mark. It was within his reach. It was also within the reach of the older woman, who had stepped forward without noticing, eyes locked on the paper, as if it were a test written by fate. For a heartbeat, everyone waited to see who would cross the line. Captain Hayes was already walking toward them, his pace steady, his face unreadable. But he did not get there in time to claim the moment. The older woman lowered herself slowly, knees bending as if she were practicing a bow. She did not reach across the chalk mark. She stayed on her side, extended 2 fingers, and hooked the corner of the paper, dragging it toward her without lifting it. Gravel scratched softly beneath it. When it reached her side of the line, she pinched it between her fingertips and held it out at arm's length, not offering it into Brooks's hands, not forcing contact, simply presenting it as an object returned. Brooks did not step forward. He crouched where he was, 3 feet away, and extended his own hand, palm up, stopping at the chalk mark like it was a wall. The paper hovered between them for a second, balanced on air and restraint. Then the older woman let it fall into his open palm without their fingers touching. Brooks drew it back, stood up, and carried it to Carter's table. Carter took it without comment, smoothing the damp corner with the side of his hand like a man saving more than ink. Captain Hayes arrived and looked from the older woman to Brooks, then to the chalk line. He did not praise. He did not soften. He simply said, "That is correct," as if confirming a procedure. Sergeant Cole exhaled once, the smallest release. The women in line watched the exchange and did not move. They did not smile. But the younger woman's shoulders dropped, just a fraction, and her eyes lifted long enough to see that the Americans were following the same boundary the women were following. The wind died down. The rest of the papers were collected. The day continued. Yet something had changed in a way no report could capture. The prisoners had returned a document not out of obedience, but out of choice, and the guards had received it without taking anything else. In a camp defined by control, a single sheet of paper had become proof of a different kind of power, the kind that holds the line even when no one is watching. On the 6th day the camp felt less like a question and more like an answer no one had expected. The sun rose early and strong, and the higher ground stayed dry, the gravel pale again instead of black with rain. The women moved with a steadiness that had not been there at arrival, not confidence, not comfort, but a controlled endurance that did not waste motion. They lined up for breakfast with canteens clipped and towels folded, and for the first time, some of them looked straight ahead instead of at the ground. Captain Robert Hayes noticed that changed the way a man notices a shift in the wind. It could be nothing. It could be everything. He stood near Lieutenant James Carter's station while Carter prepared the daily report, papers pressed flat under stones, corners squared, dates written clean. The report would be sent up the chain, read by men who would never smell the damp canvas, never hear the way a tin cup sounds when it is set down gently instead of thrown. Carter read aloud the items that were easy to count. Supplies issued, medical checks completed, no incidents, no injuries, schedule maintained. Hayes listened, then said, "Add this," and paused because the thing he meant did not fit into a sentence. Carter waited with his pen hovering. Hayes tried again. "The boundary is holding," he said finally. Carter wrote it down in smaller letters than the rest, as if he understood it was the most important line on the page. Sergeant Ethan Cole arrived with a clipboard of his own, the perimeter notes, the guard rotation, the chalk marks refreshed at dawn. Cole's face was as usual, unreadable, but Hayes could see the relief in the way Cole no longer had to correct the same problems twice. Discipline had taken root. Corporal Daniel Brooks came to the station to report a minor issue with a latch on. A supply crate. Nothing urgent, just a detail that could become trouble if ignored. Hayes nodded, and Brooks returned to his post, moving with the quiet purpose of a man who had learned that restraint was not passive. It was active work. Near midday, the interpreter gathered the women and explained that an inspection team would arrive within the week, that records had to be accurate, that health checks would continue, that those who needed assistance would receive it. The women listened without reaction, but inside the barracks tent, the older woman opened her paperback and traced another line. The younger woman leaned in again, close but not touching, and whispered a question in her own language. The older woman answered softly, then stopped, as if surprised by her own voice. The sound was small, but it filled the tent more than any order ever had. Outside, a guard carried a crate too close to the women's walkway, not because he meant harm, but because he was thinking about the weight and the heat. Sergeant Cole saw it and called out, "Move it to the right." The guard adjusted immediately. No argument. No sigh. The women saw the correction and did not flinch. That was new. Later, the wind picked up again and rattled the canvas edges, but nothing scattered this time. The papers stayed weighted. The line stayed orderly. The fence stayed where it was, but it did not feel like it was pressing inward. As evening approached, Hayes walked the perimeter with Cole, boots crunching on dry gravel, the sky turning the color of dull steel over the ocean. They passed the women's section and heard a sound that made both men slow down. Laughter, faint and brief, like a match flaring and going out. It came from inside the tent, quickly smothered, as if the women did not trust joy yet. Hayes did not look in. He did not go closer. He simply kept walking, hands behind his back, face forward, honoring the distance that had become the camp's quiet contract. When they reached the far corner near the water point, Brooks stood at attention and then relaxed when he saw them, his posture still careful. Hayes stopped and looked at the chalk line by Brooks's boots, then at the fence beyond it, then at the darkening sky. He thought about how easy it would have been, in the first hour, for someone to cross a boundary and call it victory. He thought about how hard it was, day after day, to win without taking. He turned to Cole and said, "The world will never read this the way it happened." Cole answered, "No, sir." Hayes nodded once. Then he said the only thing that mattered, not as a speech, not as comfort, but as a standard that would outlast the week and the paperwork and the war itself. We do not have to raise our voices. We raise the bar. And in the women's tent, the older woman closed her book, set it neatly beside her folded towel, and sat with her back straight, not because she was fearless, but because she had learned something rare inside a camp built to control bodies. Dignity does not require permission. It requires a line and the courage to hold it.